guys, this is Jeff O'Connor and I want to welcome you back to my shop. Now if you remember from episode 2, we talked about how I like to lay out my dovetails for this whiskey box. So in this episode, I'm going to cut out the dovetails, we're going to proceed to outline the pins, and at the end of the episode, I'll cut those pins out and get ready for some chiseling. But first, I want to talk about something really important, and that's muscle memory. All right, guys, so here we are, we're going to talk about some muscle memory before we start cutting the dovetails. Now, something that I find critical for me is practicing some cuts before I jump into actually cutting the dovetails. Because if you haven't cut them in a while, or even if you cut them in the morning, sometimes that muscle memory fades and you end up getting a bad first couple cuts. So what I like to do is use this board here. Now this pine board, I have several lines that I put into the board that I use my gauge for, and they don't have to be spaced like dovetails, you just need to have spaces for the angles. And I practice my cuts coming in, and I'll show you here a real important factor of this. So if you look at how the blade is inside here, a perpendicular cut is very, very important when cutting dovetails. So not just cutting to the line, not just staying with your pencil mark, but actually being perpendicular. So I like to take this square here and I put it against the blade and I check to make sure that my cut is actually perpendicular. And that tells me that I'm cutting straight. So when I go to assemble my dovetails, they'll be even nicer. They'll fit even better at that point. So after I've cut several right, several left with this board, I'll use this whole top piece for the next line, and then I'll just cut it off. And I just keep working my way down. And every time I get out and get ready to do some dovetails, I start with this board first. So muscle memory is huge. Training the hand is very, very important for hand sawing, for accuracy. So that's muscle memory, my take on that. Let's start cutting some dovetails. Okay, so here we are. I've got my board set up. Now, if you remember from last time here, my board is marked on both sides with my tails. So once we start cutting the other side, we're going to come around so you can see it. But right now, the lines are facing me, so I can actually guide my saw down the line. One important thing now as we set up, when I first drew them out, remember I talked about, I didn't really think it was that important to keep them square. But now that I'm sawing and I want to have a square cut and perpendicular cut, I make sure that I keep this board nice and square within the vise so I can start a good clean cut. Now, for my dovetails, I use Rob Cosman's dovetail saw, and I have a Cocobolo handle on it. I absolutely love this saw, the best there is out there in my opinion. Very well balanced, and an important part of a good saw is that as you start to progress through the cut, the saw is doing the work, not the hand. So you shouldn't be white knuckling the saw. It should be firm in the hand, but not a super tight grip on it. So as I begin my cut, for this I line up with the line in the saw here, or with the line on the board. And what I want to do is follow that line, because the tail board really is not as important, because I'm going to align my pins to what I cut in my tails. So I like to bring my saw right up to the line of my outline here. And I just start with a very shallow cut. Now I start my cut already at the dovetail angle. I don't start it perpendicular to the board, because then it's going to create kind of a weird rounded part of the top of the tail there. So I already start the angle where I want it. And I initially just get a little shallow cut here. Start my cut. Keeping in mind, I'm trying to make sure my saw stays perpendicular here. And now I just guide it. And if you watch the blade, I try to utilize a good portion of that blade all the way through my cut. And I bring it down to my scribe line. And when you come around, I'll show you how that looks on the other side here. Same thing on this one. Start using the entire blade, keeping it perpendicular, not white knuckling, and bring that out. Next one, same thing. I love that sound. Very therapeutic. Okay, so that is the first angle here. Now we're going to start our cuts heading the opposite direction. Okay, so now we're going to be cutting the other side going over. Now I find that most people have trouble with one or the other side. This is kind of my left-handed side, when you're trying to bat left-handed. This is a little tougher for me because you have to change your body position a little bit. But what I like to do when I saw on this side is kind of cant my body in a little bit so I can make sure that I've got my eye on my perpendicular cut here. So same as before, I got my thumb behind my blade supporting it. Bring it up to that line again. Nice shallow cuts. Now I start to use the full length of the blade, following that line down to the scribe line. Again, I start at the same angle as I want to cut so I don't get that rounded look on the end of the dovetail. Okay, so now that we've got our tails cut, we're going to cut the other 3 sections off of these 2 boards, get all those cut out, and we're going to set up for our pins. Okay guys, we're here at the table saw now, so we've just cut our tails. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create, on the back of each board behind the tails, we're going to create a very shallow rabbet. And what that's going to do is when we go to draw out our pins, it's going to give us a little bit of a ledge that we can kind of lock the board on to draw it. And I'll show you how that works once we get over to back to the bench. But for right now, what I want to do is I want to set my table saw up to do a very shallow cut here. So I'm going to take my board, line it up with my blade, get my spectacles on here, and I'm going to bring my blade down to right in line with my scribe line. Right there. I'm going to lock that blade, and now I'm going to set my fence up to do a very shallow cut. And we're talking maybe a 1/16 of an inch or so of a cut, and that's going to give us just a little bit of a ledge to kind of park against our setup board for the pins. So there we have it. Now what we're going to do is run all 4 sides of our tail board. Okay, let's head back to the bench. Okay, so now that we've got our tails are cut, we also cut our shallow rabbet on the back of the board. We're ready to start working on our pin board here. So what we're going to do is take our pin board and use our marking gauge and check the thickness of that. Again, we drop it down on the table like we did the first time to mark out the tails. Lock that down. Now we're going to transfer that line to these boards. Now, the difference between these and the tail boards is we're not going to do the shoulders. We're only going to do the faces of these. So again, good pressure in, slight pressure down. Next board here. Again, I like doing 2 scribe lines. One for the look of it, and also because I like the way that seats my chisel when I get ready to chisel out the waist of the pins and tails. All right, so now we've got these 2 boards are marked out. The next step is to figure out how these are all going to come together and label them. So we're going to make, I like the way that looks. So we're going to flip those up. We'll make, this one's going to be the top, and this will be the bottom. So now with a pencil, I'm going to mark all these, so when I start doing my pin layout, I'll know which boards to use. So this will be A, this will be A, this will be B, this will be B, C, C, and D. And real quick, since I've got these boards here now, I'm going to go ahead and just stick my pencil in here and outline these 4 lines. That's going to help me when I start cutting out again. In anything you're doing, you're trying to maintain precision. Make sure you have as crisp lines as you can get. Pay dividends in the end. Okay, so now I've got my pin boards are ready, my tail boards are ready, and we're going to start drawing out these pins. Okay, so we're going to start this process. We've shifted Hans over to the heater. It's a little bit cold out here in Virginia Beach today, so he'll be sitting over there watching us from afar. So first step is to get yourself some type of support for your board. This is going to hold your tail board. Now I use a square piece of walnut for this process. You can also use the side of your hand plane. You can turn it on its side and use it as a support as well. I don't do that because I've got a hot dog handle on top of my plane here, so I only use the walnut for that process. So first step we're going to do here, put my chair over here, is we're going to line up the top of this A board with the top of this. So I bring it over to my vise, and just by feeling the top here, I can tell when I'm in line with the top of this board. I tighten that down. Now I shift this support back. Now I'm taking the A board and I'm mating it up with the A on this side. Now remember, this is where that rabbet we cut comes in handy, because now as I set this board in here, I park it right against the edge of the board and it locks it in there really nicely for me. So now with that set, I'm ready to start using my marking knife to start scribing lines. So what I'm going to do is first off I'm going to take my shim and I'm going to shift it over to accommodate for the saw kerf. So you see I have a 25 written on here. For different types of woods, you're going to use a different side of this shim. And for pine, I use the 25. So I take the 25 side and I shift this board to the left and I use my shim to guide me. And that moves it over right probably about a 1/16 of an inch or so. Next thing I do is I take my knife here and I'm going to scribe 3 lines, all on the right side tails. And what I'm doing is creating a little kerf in there, and that kerf is actually going to be where I put my saw blade to cut these pins out. Okay, now before I move this board, I keep it in place, and very, very lightly, I put my saw in here to create a little more of a kerf. Now I'm barely holding on to this saw. I'm really letting the saw do its own work here. I'm just kind of guiding it. And I'll show you what that does once I pull this board away. Just let the weight of that saw, a little bit of a push behind it, deepen the kerf in the top of that pin board. Okay, so that's the one side. Now I'm going to take my shim again. I look, verify, I'm on 25 again. So now I'm going to flip it, and this time I'm moving it the other direction. And now I'm going to do the kerf here on the left side. Again, I do 3 on each side. Depending on the type of wood I'm using, with walnut or something like that, or harder woods, sometimes I get it in there and I kind of saw with the blade itself and just create a really nice deep canal there. Okay. Again, come in with the saw. Nice light touch. You can see how it just kind of falls into the kerf of the tail there. Very little pressure. Last one here. Okay. Now as I take this board away, you'll see what I've created. Now, if you look across the top here, I've actually created the actual kerfs that my blade is going to sit in as I cut. So in order to start these cuts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise this up a little bit. Use my square here to make sure I'm nice and straight. Before I do anything, I make sure that I mark my waist. Now on the pin board, I'm cutting away these sections. So I mark those right now so I don't forget. So I do a really stupid move. Next thing I do is I take my square and I line it up with the cut, and I just lengthen that line there to give me a nice visual on where my saw needs to go as I carry it down the kerf. Now the saw is going to do most of the work. I'm just going to kind of guide it and keep it straight. But again, a perpendicular cut is very important for all of this. This step right here is one of the most important, because if your pins are not cut out properly, you're going to have a lot of problems, a lot of gaps when you go to assemble your dovetails. So now in this process, I like to set my blade in that kerf and get it started. Bring it across the top. Again, I'm not gripping very hard at all. And I'm just going to follow that line straight down. And I'm going to let that saw do all the work. Next one. You can see once you get that blade started, if you just allow it to do its own work, you're going to end up with a nice straight cut. You start getting crooked cuts or off perpendicular cuts when you're pushing the blade too hard. Okay, now if we want to shift to the other side, we're going to cut the other side of these. Okay, same thing as before. I lead it in, slowly come across. If you look at my hand, you can see I'm not white knuckling this at all. It's a very, very soft grip on the saw. Enough to control it, but not redirect it. With a high quality saw like this, that blade is doing a fantastic job in keeping my cut straight. So I don't want to fight that. And that was one of the hardest things for me when I started doing this and learning how to do it. When I was in Rob Cosman's Purple Heart project, they had to constantly tell me to stop death gripping my saw, because I was holding it so tight, my knuckles were so white as I was cutting, and it was really throwing my cuts off. So maintain that grip is critical. All right, so now we've got the cuts across our pins. What we're going to do now is we're going to do the exact same process on the other three sides of our pin boards, and then we'll be ready to cut those out and get ready for chiseling. All right, now we're set up to do some sawing. And what I like to do before I start chiseling out the waist of these dovetails is I like to cut away large sections of the wood so I'm not wasting too much time chiseling. So if you look at all my X areas here, I'm going to try to cut away a lot of that in both the tail and the pin boards. To do that, I'm going to use this saw from Blue Spruce Tools. Absolutely love this saw. It's the handling of it, the balance, the precision is incredible. It's just a very well engineered saw. Once I get done doing that, I'm going to cut the shoulders off this board, and for that I use these tools, and I'll get into those once we get rolling on that. So first we're going to start cutting out the waist, all the X marks of my tailboard. So I'm going to come in an angle here as soon as I get my glasses on. And you'll feel that as soon as it breaks away. It's really easy to stop that cut. Okay, so that I would do on all four sides of that board, but to save time and so I don't bore you guys to death, I'm going to shift over to the pin board real quick. And I like to get pretty close to that bottom line, but not really encroach on it. So if you look now what I leave at the bottom, that's all I have to chisel out once I start the chisel process. Okay, so now again, we would do this on the other 3 sides of that pin board. And once those are done, the next step is to cut the shoulders off of the tail boards. So I put it sideways on my vise here. Now for that I use a square from Blue Spruce, a Sloyd knife, and then Rob Cosman's crosscut saw, which is phenomenal, and then a chisel also here. So the first thing I do is the scribe line I did originally, I just want to make that a little more prominent. So I stick my knife in there, put my square against it, and make it a little bit deeper. From there I take my chisel and I just create a little groove there for my saw. And I come in with my saw here. Nice and slow, getting a nice square shoulder cut. Now I shift over to the other side over here. And I do the same process on this side. Go in that curve there, highlight it. I'm gonna swing around here real quick, get my chisel in there. And with this is just creating like a little curve for my blade to sit nicely. Come in there again with my crosscut saw. Nice and slow, keep that perpendicular cut. And we're all set. Now I'll cut all 4 of these sides, switch, I'll put the other tail board in, and we'll get all that done. And then we'll be ready for some chiseling. All right, so what we've got here now is tail boards, pin boards, cut out. We got the waist cut out of those. The next step now is going to be to chisel it. And we're going to chisel out the rest of this waist and get really clean cuts so our dovetails come together nicely. In an upcoming video, we'll cover the chiseling and how I do that. But up until then, if you guys are on the couch and you're not getting in the shop, remember, this wood ain't going to work itself. I'm Jeff O'Connor, and thanks for joining me again.